And this recording will be given to you in a follow-up email. It will also be posted to our YouTube channel for future viewing. But just keep in mind, we are recording this. All right. And at any time, if you have questions for Ben, please do put it, if you can, try to put it in the Q&A box. That's how we like to keep track of all of our questions. It's just much easier for us to keep track than the chat. So again, at any point during tonight, if you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A box. We will have a Q&A section at the end of tonight. And yeah, so we'll try to get to all of your questions tonight. So please do put it in that Q&A box. And then again, everybody who registered will receive a follow-up email. It will include links, emails, anything we're talking about tonight, and the recording of tonight. So if you are scared that you won't get one of the links that Ben's mentioned, don't worry about it. We will put it in that follow-up email. Okay. And then, whoop, there we go. If you are new here to Wild Virginia, we are a state-based conservation organization, and we work on a few key areas of conservation throughout the state. Habitat connectivity is a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So protecting habitat corridors and installing wildlife crossings, and that's my program. And then we have another water quality focused program, and it has a couple of focuses. One is around preventing PFAS from entering our waterways and also limiting the harms of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. We also have a Clean Water Advocates program. I recommend looking into that. I think that is the next session is coming up soon. And then also, of course, we provide lots of diverse educational opportunities like the one tonight, all around any sort of conservation environmental topic going on right now. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing right now. And I am going to introduce our speaker. So we are super excited to have Ben here tonight. He's an associate professor at Virginia Tech, and he is also the founder of the Virginia Institute for Invertebrates. And we're so excited he reached out to us to do a webinar and to collaborate with invertebrate conservation and how it relates to our programs here at Wild Virginia. And we're so excited because this is a knowledge base that we hadn't had before, and we'd love to fill. So we're super excited to have Ben here talk about invertebrates and conservation. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Jess. Let me get my screen back up. All right, is that visible?
Yep, looks great.
Super. Hey, wow, good evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I'm a big fan of the Wild Virginia Speaker Series, and so it's a real pleasure to be in it. As Jess said, I want to talk to you tonight about issues of habitat connectivity, but from the perspective of invertebrate conservation. So I like to say, if you're going to think conservation, think invertebrates. So Virginia has a wealth of invertebrates. It has a real special collection. So all of the animals you see here on the screen are native to Virginia. They span everything from flatworms to my favorite down here at the bottom, the Virginia carpenter bee. And Virginia is home to an extraordinary collection of endemic, particularly cave species. We have cave arthropods, amphipods, millipedes, beetles, spiders that occur nowhere else in the world, but one or a few caves in Virginia. So Virginia in particular has a rich heritage of invertebrate diversity. More broadly speaking, though, invertebrates are at least 95% of all animal species. Some estimates put it as high as 99. It depends on how you count and what you take as known, but to first approximation, every animal is an invertebrate. And terrestrial arthropods, so just the jointed limbed organisms like spiders and insects and crayfish that live on land and in the fresh water on land, they collectively outmass the wild mammals by a factor of 30, right? So for every kilogram of wild mammal, there's 30 kilograms of arthropod. Relatedly, they are essential components of our ecosystems. Invertebrates are decomposers, nutrient recyclers, and generally speaking, they make up a key layer between our primary producers and the big things we usually pay attention to, vertebrates like birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. So roughly speaking, as go the invertebrates, so goes everything else, which is why we should be concerned that invertebrates are in decline globally. That's why I founded the Virginia Institute for Invertebrates. I can't take credit for everything we do. I've got a fantastic board of directors, but it was concern over that decline that prompted the formation of this organization with a three-part mission. Our aim is to monitor those population changes in invertebrates over long periods of time, to record and discover their rich natural history, the vast majority of which is completely unknown. And what I want to focus on tonight is to conserve that extraordinary diversity, all those different ways of making a living in the world, and all the ways in which they sustain the remainder of our ecosystems, the other life on land. With respect to conservation, the Institute's focus is, to a large extent, on connectivity. And so I want to talk about how that relates to our two broad conservation goals. So the aim here is to maximize two things: native biodiversity and native abundance. Abundance simply meaning the number of organisms present, right? Both of those aspects, abundance and biodiversity, are generally negatively impacted by fragmentation, by the opposite of habitat connectivity. And what I want to do for the remainder of my talk is two different things. I want to give you a sort of background on the problems related to habitat fragmentation. So I'll introduce three particular invertebrates native to Virginia, and they'll serve as examples for us throughout the talk. But then I want to say some general things about what fragmentation is, and in particular, how it affects populations of invertebrates. How does it affect the diversity of spineless things? How does it affect the numbers of invertebrates living in Virginia? And I'll highlight one particularly pernicious sort of fragmentation, which has to do with roads. Well, which is roads. In the second half of the talk, I want to talk about solutions, things that we might be able to do, things that we are doing in order to mitigate these bad effects of fragmentation. And I'll emphasize in particular what VII, the Virginia Institute for Invertebrates, is trying to do about it. So let's start with three characters that I promise will show up later in the talk. You can keep score. The first one, this adorable little fuzzball on the left, is the rusty-patched bumblebee. This one has become something of a poster child for invertebrate conservation because it was once, and when I say once, I don't mean a long time ago, I mean quite recently, common and abundant throughout the northeastern United States. In fact, it only really began declining in abundance in the 1990s, but it's now extirpated from 87% of its historical range. And for that reason, it became the first bee to receive federal endangered species status, recognition as an endangered species. Now, it's uncertain what has caused that decline. Almost certainly there are a number of contributing factors, including parasites spread from commercial bumblebee production, but it's also almost certainly the case that habitat fragmentation contributed to this astonishing decline. The second invertebrate I'd like to introduce you to, also an insect, is one of my favorites that you can find this time of year, the eyed elater. It's our largest cook beetle. If you pick this big fella up, and this guy is probably about 1.5 inches long, if you pick him up and hold him upside down in your hand, they have a locking mechanism that allows them to suddenly release a bunch of energy and snap their body straight and hurl themselves into the air, making a clicking sound. For these big ones, I have to admit it's startling, even though I know it's coming. It always startles me. Kids laugh at me, but never learn. It is not on the endangered species list. The eyed elater is ostensibly common in Virginia's forests. But I will point out that its conservation status has not been assessed. In fact, throughout this talk, one of my aims is to highlight the large number of unknowns about invertebrate diversity and conservation. Most species of invertebrates, we have no idea what their conservation status is. This is one of them. Its larvae, interestingly, are voracious predators of other wood-boring beetle larvae. So they lay their eggs on the soil or in rotting logs, and their larvae, so-called wireworms, seek out enormous quantities of the larvae of wood-boring longhorn beetles in particular. And what's interesting for us from the perspective of habitat fragmentation is that despite the fact it has wings under those hardy elytra there, it's unlikely to travel between even modestly separated wood patches. Now, again, no one has specifically studied the dispersion of the eyed elater, so far as I've been able to determine, but other beetles have been examined in some detail, particularly weevils that have agricultural impact. And despite the fact they possess wings, they generally, like this fella, prefer to crawl. And when you crawl, your range is limited. Right? Another interesting feature of this beetle is that it seems to have a penchant for laying on pavement that matches its coloration. In fact, every one of these I've ever found, I found on pavement, specifically asphalt, right? So this sort of black and white speckling pattern that makes them actually difficult to spot. And finally, I'll introduce you to an insect you probably already know. It's on a bunch of license plates in the state. This is Virginia's state insect, the eastern tiger swallowtail, Papilio glaucus. And it lays its eggs on the tips of branches with sunlight exposure. This is actually relevant later on. And for that reason, well, in part for that reason, and in part because it's looking for floral resources for flower nectar, it's attracted to the open space and floral resources of roads. Okay, these three are going to show up as examples of ways in which fragmentation affects biodiversity and abundance for invertebrates. Let me say a little something about fragmentation in general. So what do we mean by fragmentation? Fragmentation ecologically is a disruption of continuous habitat that was once connected, that results in little islands or fragments of the original habitat type isolated by an expanse of distinct habitat. It's not hard to visualize this. The satellite image on the right there is just a more or less random patch of Virginia just east of Appomattox. And you can see little islands of forest, which would have been the dominant habitat, the dominant ecosystem in this part of Virginia. And these patches are isolated by combinations of lawns, agricultural fields, and light residential development. We're focusing on fragmentation because that kind of habitat disruption is considered a leading cause of biodiversity loss worldwide. So one big reason we're losing species is habitat fragmentation. But there are lots of ways in which fragmentation results in the loss of biodiversity. In the first place, fragmentation simply involves habitat replacement, right? So in order to fragment a habitat, in order to break up a continuous, or what was one continuous type of ecosystem, like an expanse of forest, you replace some of the forest, some of the original ecosystem, with something else. For the species originally in a habitat, conversion just means loss of habitat, direct reduction of populations. On the other hand, species that happen to thrive in the matrix, so that's the fancy word used for the disruptive ecosystem, the thing that you substituted with, In this case, in the picture on the right, it's agricultural land. Species that happen to thrive in the matrix will increase in abundance. But a depauperate matrix, so a matrix that does not support diverse or abundant communities, of course, means an overall loss of biodiversity and abundance. So this picture on the right, as I'm sure you guessed from the grid of roads, is not from Virginia. This is in the middle of Iowa, where I happen to have been driving at one point. And the little green strip along the river you see here is a tiny fragment of habitat that was set aside as conservation land. And that habitat now sits in a sea of matrix of new ecosystem that's replaced that native habitat. And most of that is this brown tilled agricultural land, which is the best example of a depauperate environment. Relatively few species live and thrive there. So collectively, this replacement of one habitat for another results in direct loss of, at the very least, abundance and generally species diversity. But there are more subtle ways in which fragmentation can result in changes in abundance and diversity. So in the first place, it matters how big the islands that you have left are. Fragment size is highly predictive of species richness. So the bigger the chunks of original habitat that are left, the more varieties of living things, and in our case, invertebrates, are left. Species abundance, though, is determined by the availability of resources to them that are accessible in a landscape. And what that means is that, let me actually skip down a little bit. It may not be relevant that we have broken apart a continuous habitat as long as fragments or a collection of fragments containing the necessary resources for a species are close enough together that a species can forage as it normally would. So that's what's being depicted in the center of our three panels up here, right? So in the first panel on the left, you have a large fragment that contains all of the resources a species might need. Standing forest, dead wood, flowers for foraging, for nectar. In the middle panel, you have a series of smaller fragments, none of which has all of the resources, but insofar as those fragments can be reached, the gaps can be bridged by the organism in question, you can still sustain a healthy population size. Right? It's as if the breaks aren't there. But of course, if we separate those fragments more and more, eventually we pass beyond the range at which a species can forage. And in that case, none of the fragments is suitable habitat, and you suffer, in that case, catastrophic loss of populations of that species. What's not known is, well, a lot of things about this with respect to invertebrates. It's not known how small a patch can be and still sustain what we would consider something like an approximation of the native invertebrate community. How small of a patch of forest can I retain to have the kinds of diversity of decomposers and pollinators and predators that I would have had in the historical habitat. For any given species, it's not clear how big of a patch it needs. Different species have different resource demands. And in particular, it's not even known how far most species can forage. How far can that, say, eyed elater go in order to find actually the nectar and pollen that the adults feed on? How far can that rusty patched bumblebee fly in order to locate floral resources? We don't know for most species. And even if it can reach that far, at what cost does that come to reproduction? It takes energy to span greater distances to collect what you need to live. All of these are unknowns. But we can make some reasonable guesses. I said fragmentation probably had something to do with the decline of the rusty patched bumblebee, and insofar as it does, it's likely to be a consequence of the needs of that bumblebee. So rusty patched bumblebees need three things. They need woodlands or woodland edges in which to overwinter, the founding queens. They need open sites with loose soil in order to nest. So generally in fields, abandoned rodent nests, etc. And they require floral resources. They need flowers that are blooming over the span of their long foraging season. So they need to be able to find flowers at each stage of the spring and summer. And in their range, habitats are severely fragmented, and it's entirely plausible that we've simply, even though they're generalist foragers and they make use of a wide range of flowers, including invasives, and it's simply the case that the stands of woods that they need and the nesting sites that they need and the flowers that are available to them may simply be too far separated to sustain a population of bees. Okay, what else does fragmentation do? We've used the words both I and Jess, continuity, a couple of times this evening already. What do I mean by that? Continuity means a couple of things. Maybe the easiest to picture is simply the movement of animals. So a habitat is continuous insofar as animals can traverse the habitat without impedance, right? They can get from one place to another, connected in that sense. So organisms from one location can mix with organisms of another. But it also refers to gene flow. Genetically speaking, we talk about habitats being connected insofar as organisms from one can mate with organisms from the other, right? So two populations of bees are genetically connected only insofar as they can actually produce offspring together. Fragmentation disrupts both of those kinds of flow, both those kinds of continuity. If local populations can't receive immigrants, right? If you can't bolster a dwindling local population with immigrants from another population, then that local population is more susceptible to extinction. Its population numbers are more prone to vary widely from year to year, and it's more likely to be accidentally wiped out in any one year. So some noctuid moths and aphids fall into this bin. But fragmentation can also genetically isolate populations from one another. A great example, actually, terrestrial snails. Some ground beetles as well, but snails are our classic case of very slow, very weak dispersers. They don't get very far, and they don't get there very fast. And it doesn't take that much of a barrier to genetically isolate populations from one another such that they no longer mix in breeding. But of course, whether fragmentation of a habitat results in either of these kinds of disruptions, either sort of discontinuity, depends on the dispersal abilities of the animal. So the 13 lanes of highway in the upper image there from San Francisco, that's probably a barrier to most invertebrates. But depending on the species, so too is that footpath in the lower picture, right? If you're a 1/4-inch wide snail, a 3-foot wide sandy patch through the woods, it can be a significant barrier that simply isn't crossed. Again, big unknowns for invertebrates. We just don't know what the dispersal capabilities are of most species. I can't tell you the size range of barriers that matters in any concrete way because I don't know how far most species are able to get. These are essential unknowns under active research. The other thing we don't know is how long we have to wait to tell if there is genetic isolation. So when we do genetic studies and look at the ancestry of different populations of invertebrates and ask, for example, do these two snails interbreed? What we see in their genomes is not a snapshot of what's happening now, but what happened generations ago. And how many generations ago and how long those generations are depends on the organism that we're looking at. So we don't know how long the time lag is in the signal. Fragmentation also has an impact by way of edge effects. So edges are regions where two different habitat types come together, like in this photograph of forest abutting, in this case, grazing pasture. Edges, so where the trees meet the field, they differ in their very, very local climate and the plant communities they sustain. They differ both from the climate and community of plants you would find deeper in the woods and from the climate and community of plants you would find out here in the middle of the pasture. Some species thrive in edges. In fact, the edge effect was named when it was noticed that game animals of interest were much more abundant in these kinds of edge environments than they were elsewhere. And the same is true for invertebrates. There are some species that thrive in having this conjunction of different environments with different sets of resources that they may need. Others, on the other hand, avoid edges altogether. What that means is that at the transition between the forest and the field, you end up with a distinct community of organisms. It's a third sort of habitat. It doesn't look like a forest community. It doesn't quite look like a pasture community. In terms of reducing or threatening biodiversity and abundance, edges tend to be more exposed to invasion by invasive plant and animal species, as well as pesticides, herbicides, and many types of pollution. So were this the edge abutting an agricultural field, that edge sees a lot more herbicide and pesticide than the core habitat deeper in the woods does. It's also the case that edge-dwelling insects, for example, can be more or less exposed to predators relative to core dwellers. I have to say more or less because, again, it depends on the species. Some species, some herbivores, some grasshoppers, for example, seem to thrive in edges precisely because their predators are missing there. On the other hand, other species exhibit much greater loss due to predation at the edges because they're getting preyed upon by a different mixture of predators than would have been the case in either pure habitat. How much edge effects matter depends on the shape of the fragment. This matters when we want to think about how to mitigate the effects of fragmentation. All this picture is showing, if the numbers and geometry is freaking you out, is that a rectangular patch of the same area as a circular patch has a much higher proportion of edge, a much lower proportion of core habitat inside, right? So if you can make a circular patch, you protect much more of the original habitat than if you make a long rectangular patch. And similarly, patch size shows up here as well because edge effects tend to be a fixed distance, 100 meters, say. In that case, a small circular patch will have very little core relative to this transition zone between ecosystem types, between habitats. Another way in which fragmentation affects biodiversity and abundance is invasive species. By definition, fragmentation involves disruption, involves disturbance. So you're replacing some habitat with this matrix, with this alternative habitat, and breaking apart an originally contiguous habitat like a forest. And that disturbance tends to favor, in particular, invasive alien plants. So matrix and edges are particularly favorable habitats for these invasive alien plants. The little picture here, I doubt it shows up well enough on your screen, but this is just a short, maybe 20-foot long section of a small road here in Blacksburg, Virginia. And in that section, there are at least two, I think three varieties of invasive bush honeysuckle. There's one or two species of privet and a big old autumn olive all crammed into that little space. Now, insect communities are dictated by plant resources. So invasives tend to reshape not just the plant communities they're a part of, but the insect communities that feed on those plants. Broadly speaking, those kinds of community shifts are likely to harm specialists, so invertebrates and in particular insect pollinators that specialize on one or two particular kinds of plants, more than the generalists like bumblebees that'll forage from lots and lots of different flowers. But again, there's a laundry list of unknowns. How much do these invasive alien plants impact populations of the generalists like bumblebees, like the rusty-patched bumblebee? Is the combined availability of native plants sufficient to sustain abundant populations, regardless of whether or not invasives are present? Don't know. So far, I've been talking about fragmentation and disruption of continuity for terrestrial ecosystems, for land. But what about our waterways? This part of Virginia, our streams and rivers are very important. Well, I'd like to highlight the work of one of VII's board members, Brian Brown, who for years has studied the ways in which connectivity in waterways determines biodiversity, determines community structure of the organisms that live in those waterways, in particular invertebrates. So aquatic invertebrate communities are structured by the way organisms move through various parts of a watershed. Generally speaking, organisms tend not to disperse upstream or from channel to channel, right? So the little thin arrow labeled B here and the little thin arrow labeled C, those are showing weak movement of animals upstream or from one channel to another in a watershed. Main stems, right? So where your streams come together into larger creeks and rivers, they receive organisms from many headwater channels. That's these big arrows A. And within a main stem, as shown by this big arrow D, once you get out to the New River, for example, there's much more homogenization. Organisms are able to move freely in one direction or the other. What this means is that headwater communities, so our mountains, streams, and springs, they're shaped mostly by the local properties of the stream and the ecosystem around it. It's the woods around the stream that determine what the community of things is in those little mountain creeks. On the other hand, main stem communities, they're shaped mostly by the sum of the immigrants being, well, essentially washed down from the headwaters, right? So the inhabitants of the New are far less sensitive on the details of what's around the banks of the New than the inhabitants of the creeks that feed the river. What does that mean for consequences of fragmentation? So here's a classic bit of fragmentation that I know I've heard spoken of in Wild Virginia seminars before. This is a hanging culvert. That's a pretty serious barrier if you are a small invertebrate in that creek. There are definitely some crayfish that don't have a problem making that climb, but whether they'd be inclined to do so is another question. Culverts like that, when we're thinking about invertebrates as opposed to, say, fish, they reduce diversity and abundance primarily by changing what the creek looks like on the upstream and downstream side. They change the flow rate, they change the sedimentation, and they can change the inputs from the surrounding forest. So, for example, the upstream end of this culvert is crammed with leaves. Those leaves would have provided forage for a range of aquatic insects on the other side of this, on the downstream side of this culvert, had the flow been unobstructed. On the other hand, main stem barriers, so like dams in the river, they change communities by blocking the movement of organisms. So these are two different mechanisms for aquatic systems. It depends on whether you're in the headwaters or in a main stem. Generally speaking, removing barriers is positive for biodiversity and abundance, but you shouldn't expect the same kind of changes for aquatic communities you see in terrestrial ones. Aquatics don't disperse in the same way that terrestrial organisms do. And for headwater communities in particular, watershed protection, so keeping the community of plants and other animals that input nutrients into those headwater streams is just as important for maintaining diversity and abundance. Ah, ecological traps. So fragmentation can and does result in a variety of so-called ecological traps. These are patches of habitat that present cues attractive to animals, but an environment that is inhospitable or fatal. Let me give you some examples. Here's a big one. This is from a relatively old paper. This is 1998. What you see in all those pictures, it's a little hard to make out. The top row, all these images are mayflies. The mayflies have the adult forms here have emerged from a stream or a river, or sometimes uh, lake fed by a river. They've emerged from their flowing waterways. They are mating and looking for a place to lay their eggs. In the top row, they're laying their eggs on dry pavement. This is a road. In the other two rows, if I recall, they are on either glass or automobile paint. The reason they're laying eggs on all these surfaces is that for the last 200 and what? Somewhere between 2 and 300 million years, a fantastic cue to these insects for finding a waterway at night is polarized light. The light that's reflected from a flat surface like a river or a stream is polarized, and that has been their primary cue for finding, even in dim starlight, the appropriate sort of waterway in the forests and open fields where they evolved. At present, however, the way we have fragmented the world, we've created a number of these ecological traps. We are providing that principal cue to these animals, but from a habitat that is radically inhospitable to the aims of the animal, right? Those eggs laid on the dry pavement, they're dead. Those will not be a new generation of mayflies. The eggs laid on the hood of my truck, those are dead. They will not be a new generation of mayflies. These are ecological traps. No doubt, there are many unrecognized ecological traps affecting invertebrates. Traps, we're altering the milieu in which these animals live so fast that we don't have time to keep up with the sorts of novel environments and cues they present to invertebrates. I'm showing you the ID later here because I suspect that, in fact, asphalt is a sort of possibly weak ecological trap for the eyed elater. They think it's a great place to hang out during the day where they are cryptically colored, right? So maybe the eyed elater's preference for pavement is in fact an ecological trap. It's a trap because this is an inhospitable environment. They get run over. Of course, what's not known is how much of an impact do most of these negative interactions have on populations or diversity. What I mean is, for example, butterflies, many butterflies, including that tiger swallowtail, like to forage along roads because that's where there are flowers and that's where there is open space. They get hit by cars all the time. Some studies have tried to quantify how many of the foraging butterflies are killed by cars. They come up with something like 10% of the butterflies foraging in a given area. Does that matter? I don't know. What proportion is significant? For those butterflies, which naturally suffer most of their mortality in earlier stages of their lifespan, a 10% loss before they've laid the next generation of eggs might in fact be huge. This might spell doom for a population. Or it might amount to a drop in the bucket. We don't know. I wanted to talk briefly about roads as a particularly pernicious sort of habitat fragmentation. And to do that, I wanted to show you, to give you a sense for the scope of the problem. I wanted to show you some preliminary results from some work I'm doing with Dr. Yang Xiao and Will Jones, the Department of Geography at Virginia Tech. We're answering the question, well, more broadly, how far to the nearest road, but the data I'm going to show you here is just for Virginia. So you can ask, if I were to throw a dart at Virginia at random and ask how far away am I from a road where I'd stand at that dart, that's what we want to be able to tell you. Each of the colored dots you see here on the outline of Virginia, that's one of the darts we threw. That's a random point. And those points are colored based on the kind of habitat that's there. So deciduous forest, yellow for pasture and farmland, dark green for evergreen, et cetera. Here, I'll zoom in on Montgomery County, where I am, so that you can get a better view of what I'm talking about. The size of each of these little discs is telling us how far away that point is from a road. So we have very small red dots for developed places in town where you're basically standing on a street wherever you throw a dart. And you see that there's large discs when you're up in the national forest and about as far away as you can get from a road. So given the network of roads in Virginia, take a second and make your guess. How far are you likely to be from a road if I were to drop you in the state at random? The answer is, more often than not, you're less than 120 meters or so from a road. 95% of the time, you will be closer than 621 meters. The answer is pretty damn close, particularly if edge effects, right? So a road is a kind of matrix. It's a disruption. It separates habitat into fragments. And there are those edge effects we talked about that alter the margins of that habitat. If those edge effects are on the, something like a span about 100 meters, the fact that you're almost always within 600 meters of a road is a big deal. The fact that most of the time you're within 120 meters of a road means you're almost always looking at edge. Yeah. Roads as fragmenters of the habitat have lots of negative impacts. Chemical pollution, particularly from worn brakes and catalytic converters. Noise pollution, which does in fact matter to some invertebrates too. Microclimatic effects, so roads are hot and dry relative to the surrounding environment. They also constitute barriers to movement. Now, Wild Virginia in particular has done a great deal of work with wildlife crossing when we're thinking about vertebrates, right? But they're even bigger barriers to movement for little things. So, on the left-hand side, this tragic little bumble flower beetle is trying to cross just a small dirt road in the national forest. Don't worry, after I took the picture, I picked him up and put him on the other side. But it was going to take him a good long time if he were able to make it at all. Now imagine, if you look at the picture on the right, that you're one of those tiny quarter-inch wide snails. That's a paved road. Not even a big paved road, but it's a real big impediment to you ever seeing the other side. There's also the problem of roadkill. Invertebrates get hit by cars too, though mercifully, people usually don't end up going to the hospital. So it's not the same kind of problem that it is for large mammals, but it is a problem nonetheless for abundance of these invertebrate species. That poor squashed fellow there is a sword wolf spider in the genus Gladicosa. And just informally, one day, my daughter and I walked about 1 kilometer of that same Forest Service road the beetle was trying to cross and found 8 of those Gladicosa spiders out hunting and 16 of them squashed. Another one of the unknowns is how much of an impact roadkill actually has on local invertebrate populations. Estimates for some Midwestern states are that billions of butterflies are ultimately killed every season, every year. For these spiders, we're finding them dead to live at a ratio of 2 to 1. These aren't rare spiders. Does this attrition actually have an effect on the breeding populations? Nobody knows. Roads do, however, offer some positive effects. They increase habitat and floral resources for pollinators, and they can connect disparate patches of open habitat. In other words, roads themselves, or more accurately, the borders of roads, serve as corridors, connecting patches of habitat. And I'm showing you that tiger swallowtail here because tiger swallowtails love road cuts, because they like to lay their eggs on the tips of sun-exposed branches. And what do you get when you cut a hole through the forest, you get lots of sun-exposed branch tips. It may be the case that there's a positive effect on population of tiger swallowtails. There definitely is for a range of other insects. So here's some takeaways from our discussion of fragmentation. Every species experiences fragmentation differently. There are some features that robustly increase abundance and diversity in a fragmented habitat. Right? There's lots of variation, but generally speaking, patch size, diversity of patch types, low distance between your patches, and an appropriate microclimate and plant community composition of your patches all contribute positively to biodiversity and abundance. And finally, aquatics and terrestrials need to be treated differently. Okay, with that in mind, what can we do about these problems? A good motto, I think, for conservation in general: perfect is the enemy of good. Obviously, in an ideal world, we just wouldn't chop up the habitats. Right? If you want to maximize diversity and abundance, leave it alone. That's not going to happen. So what's the best that we can do? Well, there's a hierarchy of options here. Maybe the gold standard is large patch preservation, right? The idea here is to preserve large tracts of old growth forest or grassland in Virginia, especially those harboring unique or rare communities. And there are organizations in the state that do a great job pursuing this strategy. So for instance, the 500-Year Forest Foundation or the Nature Conservancy. There are other ways to go. So this is a map no doubt familiar to some of you watching this webinar. This is from Virginia's Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. And if you can't have a giant chunk of habitat, you can aim for a giant connector between habitats, right? So a continuous stretch of high quality habitat that allows organisms to move from one remaining patch to another. And you can conceive of corridors on many scales. So this is on a very large scale, that of the state. But we could think of local corridors connecting parks to national forest, for example. Importantly, conservation corridors work differently for invertebrates than they do for vertebrates. Vertebrates, we hope, move freely through a corridor, that they use it to access habitat and resources separated from where they came from. For invertebrates, the corridor itself has to be a habitat. In other words, many or most invertebrates are weak dispersers. They don't get very far in any one generation. So to make use of a corridor, you really need them to sustain breeding populations such that multiple generations can bridge that physical gap. I will say that the evidence for the effectiveness of conservation corridors on a small scale for invertebrates, particularly insects, is mixed. However, I will temper that by pointing out that very few studies have looked at the effects directly on diversity and abundance in real-world settings over significant time spans. So a lot of these experiments involve one particular taxon, that is to say one species of insect in a laboratory setting over a very short span of time, and it's not at all clear what those results tell us about connecting chunks of prime habitat in the real world. For most studies that do take that kind of perspective, and most of the invertebrate taxa examined, restoring connectivity unsurprisingly improves abundance and diversity. Well, let's move down our hierarchy. If we can't have a giant patch and we can't have a continuous corridor connecting prime habitat, what about stepping stones? So this is a real example, again, from Montgomery County, where I am. What you see here in green are patches with conservation easements on them. And you have a nice sequence that moves from this large patch of intact forest habitat in little stepping stones to the upper part of the screen where it finally abuts the national forest and you have a large contiguous habitat, right? So an alternative strategy is to not try for a contiguous stretch, but rather to exploit the fact that as long as patches are close enough together for organisms to use, they can both disperse across them and maintain healthy populations in them. Stepping stones are more realistic to achieve. It's very, very hard to acquire the kind of protection that one wants for a continuous sequence of privately owned properties. Their effectiveness, though, depends upon dispersal capabilities of the organisms that you're trying to provide continuity for. And again, We just don't know what most of those are. But I will stress that in some studies, stepping stones actually worked better than continuous corridors in terms of promoting abundance and diversity over the meta community. And finally, moving down a little bit further in our hierarchy of possibilities, is the idea of simply exploiting lot margins. In other words, creating far more, far smaller stepping stones. So as large parts of the state are converted from agricultural land to development, as you're seeing in this image here from Blacksburg, uh, it offers the opportunity to protect maybe not, 5, 10 acres at a shot, but something like, a 30, 40 meter wide margin on the edge of a development, on what was an agricultural field, on what will be a planned housing community. Now, those kinds of patches, they suffer from a high proportion of edge habitat. There's evidence that some species will ignore or refuse relatively thin corridors, right? That they won't disperse across them, let alone from one to the other. But some studies have shown the successful use of small disturbed corridors, like narrow ribbons of roadside habitat, for breeding and dispersion by things like this is another carabid beetle, harpalus. But there are lots of unknowns about the features that make such small, narrow patches effective conservation tools, but they offer significant opportunities to expand overall protected area and to fill in some of these unknowns, right? They offer a great proving ground for the science. Road verges themselves are a special kind of these sorts of patches, sometimes large corridors, sometimes small fragments like I was just talking about. I would direct you to either the Xerces Society or to the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and their Butterfly Highway Project if you'd like more information on how road verges can be used successfully to boost abundance and diversity, particularly for pollinators who are open habitat pollinators. I did want to mention road and stream crossings. Road crossing design for invertebrates is almost completely unstudied. I was trying to find some photographs of one of the few studies I was aware of where they were trying to make butterfly crossings in Northern Europe, and they had giant nets over the road. I don't see that ever happening in the United States. I don't know that those worked anyway, but I will say that whatever the structure of crossing you're imagining, invertebrates require consideration of microclimate along the crossing. Because again, for most inverts, the crossing is the habitat. You're only connecting populations on both sides if the crossing itself can sustain habitats. This is why this is Estonia, this particular green crossing. But I showed that picture because in a lot of ways, you can imagine making that ideal for invertebrate use as much as it is for vertebrate use. It's a question of getting the plant community right such that you can sustain small breeding populations across the crossing. For a more concrete and promising example here in Virginia, the stream simulators that were described not so long ago in a previous webinar here are promising both for aquatic invertebrates and woodland invertebrates because they provide margin habitat on either side of the streams that is plausible habitat for a wide range of slow dispersing invertebrates. And I would suggest that invertebrates should, as a matter of course, be part of wildlife crossing and connectivity plans, but as a rule, they're not. Okay. Oh, I don't want to leave out the streams. I'll say that given what we know about drivers of invertebrate diversity and abundance that I described earlier, restoring flow and sedimentation regimes is important, but protecting the surrounding terrestrial habitat is perhaps more important for headwater streams, the kinds of mountain streams common on the western side of Virginia here. Okay, takeaways. It's impossible to approach invertebrate conservation one species at a time. There are far too much diversity to imagine doing that. For invertebrates, the corridor is the habitat. And despite the uncertainty, it's clear that we can make big gains for a wide swath of invertebrate taxa with small fragments of land, of habitat of the right type in the right place. The Virginia Institute for Invertebrates embraces any opportunity to mitigate fragmentation for invertebrates. Look, if you have 10 acres, you want to donate for conservation purposes, give me a call. More than happy to make that happen for invertebrates. But we have been focusing and will continue to focus on the clear opportunity offered by small acquisitions and easements, especially as land is developed in the region. A little land can be leveraged to make a large difference. And so if you're interested in carving off a margin of a field or a half an acre that's not usable for development or business or recreation purposes, those little contributions can be strung together into a big contribution for invertebrate biodiversity and abundance. And I encourage you to get in touch with me. And finally, we recognize that it's vital that we work to resolve some of the many unknowns around invertebrate conservation. So the science here is as important as the conservation activities. Let me finish up by thanking a few folks. Ian Bell helped me out with some of the literature reviews for today. Will Jones made those great maps for us for the roads in Virginia project we're working on together. As always, I thank my board of directors, a fantastic group of scientists and conservationists, and my daughters for their assistance with some graphics. Of course, Wild Virginia for hosting me. And last but not least, I thank all of you for your attention. And I do encourage you to get in touch with me about any of this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So please do note, we will provide Ben's email and then the website in the follow-up email as well. So yeah, we have just a few minutes for maybe one or two questions. Oops. Maybe the easiest is your organization a 501c3?
So Virginia Institute for Invertebrates was incorporated at the end of last year, and we are in the process of getting our 501c3 recognition. But as any of you who've gone through this know, that can be an involved process. For us, it's a little extra involved because of the nature of our conservation and monitoring programs. We need to acquire land, and that complicates the legal structure a little bit for us.
No worry. All right. So let's see. Where are rusty patched bumblebees found in Virginia?
Oh yeah, north central. If you go to, I think DWR actually has a list of Virginia counties with rusty patched bumblebees range. That said, I don't think they've been seen in most of those counties since 2012. Another good place, if you wanted to see where they've been seen in the last decade, I would actually go to iNaturalist and use their citizen science data set. The area in the northern margin of Virginia where the bumblebee is officially to be found. The area where you see citizen science observations is much smaller, but they're still there. They're still there. I haven't seen one, but they're still there.
Awesome. And I'm kind of skipping around because I think we just have time for one more. So sorry if you have additional questions, please do email Ben or myself. I'm seeing a lot of questions on corridors and crossings. If you have any questions on those in particular, please do email me. I will provide that in the follow-up email. But one question a lot of people are asking with how they can help with sort of the data collection for any of this. And I think one of them was, can the Virginia Master Naturalist help with citizen science and any of the unknowns?
Yes, absolutely. So we are establishing the first of our monitoring sites, and we definitely, so keeping track of invertebrate populations, even if we limit ourselves to insects, is a daunting task if you want to have any idea which species are in your pile. So identifying, a sample of 3,000 individuals, even to family, is a serious task. And we will definitely be leaning on the citizen science community to help us out with that on an annual basis. If that's something you're interested in, please do send me an email. I'm happy to put you on our list of volunteers with that interest so that we can get in touch as the time draws near.
Awesome. That's probably the biggest one. And I'm so sorry. We don't have enough time for the
I
rest of
talked
the
too much.
questions.
I
No,
apologize.
it was a
I'm
great
sorry.
presentation. Please do look in the chat. Everybody's really enjoying and saying thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you. Please do. Yeah, join me in thanking our lovely presenter, Ben, for tonight. If you have any questions, again, please do email Ben about sort of his organization and invertebrates. And then if you have any questions on wildlife crossings and corridor work for sort of the state-based, you can email me or just become a Wild Virginia member. You'll get all of our action alerts. Yes, thank you so much. And we're going to stop recording and have a great evening, everyone.